Whenever a new client walks into Weeping Tree Books, I've learned to just smile. Ignoring people can be seen as a dangerous lack of respect, but drawing attention to yourself by talking can be even more deadly. A nice, quiet smile is the best middle ground. Most of the time, the customers even smile back, although some of them might just be showing off their extra teeth. Occasionally, people come in for a gift or something to read on vacation. Others are just curious about the little courtyard bookshop with a willow tree out front. I do my best to watch out for those ordinary folks while they're here. If the shelves start to rearrange themselves or the signs above the aisles turn strange, I gently call their attention in the opposite direction. Most of the time, I just make something up. Did you know about the special 30% off sale? Are you a member of our exclusive book club? Weeping Tree Books doesn't need to sell a single volume to stay in operation, and it certainly doesn't offer any memberships, but the minor annoyance is usually enough to get people oriented away from danger. Then, there are the other customers, the ones with a sheen of cold sweat who look like they haven't slept in weeks. The ones who appear normal until I look at them out of the corner of my eye and see something that belongs in a child's nightmare. Those clients always seem to know exactly what they're looking for. I've been the bookkeeper at Weeping Tree Books for over 3 months now, and in all that time, I've never once set foot out the door. And the lawyer who got me into this mess warned me that every attempt I made to escape would fail. And he was clear's throat, right. My predecessor, Anna, ran color-coded cables along the floor of the bookstore to show which paths were safe. I had hoped that one of them, the yellow one, would show a path out. As I followed it, however, I noticed something disturbing. The ceiling seemed to be getting lower as I went, the aisles grew narrower, and even the books themselves were smaller. When I banged my head against the light fixture, I couldn't deny it any longer. I was being led into some sort of tunnel. 20 minutes later, I was crawling on my knees. The volumes lying in the shelves around me were as small as Post-it notes. I was slithering on my belly when the corridor finally opened up into a larger room. And that's where I found the bodies. 1 woman and 2 children. Their clothing was from another era, but their wounds were so fresh that they might have been butchered only moments before. The cuts had been made by a small blade and maybe a pocket knife. And I could still see the shock and fear in the poor boy's wide, glassy blue eyes. The woman was clutching something in her hand, a heart-shaped locket that held black and white photos of herself and another man. X read the initials beneath her name. read his. Whoever was, his body was nowhere to be found in the gruesome menagerie around me. Meanwhile, the aisle up ahead was even tighter and unlit by a single light bulb. As I approached, I would have sworn that I felt a warm, moist wind, like someone's breath blowing out of it. I wasn't going to follow the yellow cable a single step further, even if freedom was on the other side. I knew that there was no way I could force myself to move ahead into that narrow, suffocating, hungry darkness. Since then, I've accepted my fate. I told myself that I get 3 warm meals a day and a place to sleep, and that there are plenty of people who do worse work for a lot less. I could have gone on believing that forever, if it hadn't been for a girl named Amy. I met her a few days after Thanksgiving. It was a slow afternoon with no deliveries to stock and a cold rainstorm battering down in the courtyard outside. Even the willow tree looked miserable. I would have been almost grateful to be trapped inside the warm and dry bookstore if my dinner hadn't been taking so long to arrive. John Wei, the teenage fry cook at the Chinese restaurant across the plaza, was the one who had provided my meals. He was usually so on time and prepared that I'd never even considered what might happen if one day he just didn't show up. Since I was unable to leave Weeping Tree Books, I had no other way to feed myself and no guaranteed visitors apart from the lawyer who came by each Friday to collect the week's profits. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder at the stacks, something that I usually tried not to do, especially if I felt like I was being watched. But hunger and nervousness had altered my routines. The safest part of Weeping Tree Books was where I sat, right between the front desk and the staff room where I slept. Yet I found myself pacing the aisles, flipping irritably through one cheesy romance novel after another. Where the hell was John? Someone cleared their throat behind me. Startled at first, I relaxed when I turned all the way around. There he was, a slicked-back black hair, a mischievous smile, and a steaming plastic bag of Chinese takeout in his hand. Oh, finally, I sighed. I was starting to get worried. The words died in my throat as I realized that I hadn't heard the dusty bell above the front door ring as John walked in. Whatever was standing in front of me held out the bag of food and smiled even wider. It hadn't blinked once. I backed away slowly and it matched my speed. I turned to run, and it opened its mouth wide, and the dusty bell above the bookshop door clanged. I blinked. There was no uncanny duplicate of John Way lurching toward me, opening its mouth constrictor wide to swallow me whole. Either I had imagined the whole thing, or whoever had walked into the store had just saved my life. Ben?" A tense female voice called out. This is for you. John's sick. He asked me to bring your dinner over." With her red nose and puffy eyes, the girl standing at the front desk wasn't exactly a picture of health herself. She set a bag of food down on the counter, stepped back a good distance, and sneezed into her scarf. Now that I was over my shock, it was clear that I was looking at a slimmer, more feminine version of John. I'm Amy," the girl explained. "John's older sister." I nodded, completely forgetting to say thank you. It took me a moment to realize that Amy hadn't waved goodbye and left. She was still watching me curiously, hands stuffed into her pockets while she rocked on her heels. Long shift, huh?" she commented, looking at the empty bookstore and the ticking clock above the staff room door. The longest," I grinned. "Sometimes it feels like it'll never end." I fumbled for something to say and then added, I didn't know John had a sister." That got a laugh. We might look alike, but we don't exactly get along, and besides, I was away at college until recently." Amy blushed, suddenly looking like she would have preferred to be almost anywhere else. Well, see you around, I guess. I spiced up your dinner a bit. Hope you like it." With a final sneeze into her scarf, Amy hurried back out into the rain. I wasn't sure what she had done to my chicken, but it was the best thing that I had eaten in weeks. As I stared into the darkness of the staff room that night, I found myself hoping that it would take John a while to recover. The next day dawned less rainy, but just as gloomy. I was disappointed to find that Amy had left my breakfast on the doorstep earlier that morning. I told myself that she must have woken up early to get a head start on her college work. It was better than the possibility that she was avoiding me. Around 11, a large shipment of botany guides arrived and had to be stocked, which meant that I had missed Amy's lunchtime visit too. Then in the afternoon, a customer had arrived who drove John's sister from my mind completely. He was bald and well-built, wearing a brown leather coat and jeans that looked like music. He had just bought them off the rack. He gave me a brief nod when he came through the door, and he headed directly to the depths of the shop. And that set off my alarm bells immediately. If there was one thing that I was sure of, it was that the further one ventured from the front desk, the stronger the strangeness became. I hurried after the guy to warn him, only to find that he had disappeared. Unlike most of the other ordinary clients, the guy seemed to know the layout of the place already. But when he still hadn't reappeared after 2 hours, I started to get worried. It was a relief when I finally heard his quick steps coming down the aisle. But I did wonder what he had been up to for so long back there. "Find what you were looking for?" I asked. Not today." The guy shrugged, and then left without another look back. "Not today." It was an odd comment, and most of all because it implied that he would be back. Weeping Tree Books rarely had repeat clients, although whether that was due to amnesia of the shop or just due to the fact that there wasn't much in stock for regular humans, I couldn't have said. Half an hour after the man in the leather jacket left, there was another odd occurrence, one that might have meant everything or nothing. A 20-something redhead in a black overcoat entered the plaza, walked around it in a slow, deliberate circle, and then left. He might have been lost, but he wasn't following the navigation on any phone. Nor did he ask anybody in the nail salon next door for directions. I couldn't shake the feeling that his weird behavior and the man in the brown jacket were related, but I had no idea how. I was still mulling it over when Amy arrived with my dinner. Once again, she hesitated before walking out the door. "I'm sorry I left in such a hurry yesterday. It's just when we started talking about school." Amy took a deep breath. "The truth is that I quit. The work, the pressure, it was just too much. Everyone is kind and sympathetic in telling me to take my time, but I can tell they're disappointed. My parents, they had so much invested in me, and now, hey, at least you're not stuck working in a bookstore for the rest of your life," I offered. "I guess it's true. There are always worse places you could be." Amy perked up. "Have you got any recommendations?" How could I tell her that the last book I had flipped through was over a century old, written in symbols rather than letters, and appeared to be about how to manipulate the weather? Before that, I tried to find some relaxing images of nature in a photo guide for the modern hunter. Only the first picture, however, had been taken in the woods. It showed a small house at twilight with the lights on. The photos that followed were just more shots of the same house, closer and closer each time. I quit when the photographer seemed to crawl through the kitchen window. And then there was a little volume called Your Erotic Journey. The short stories it contained were always uncannily similar to whatever the reader was fantasizing about at the time, which would have been great if it wasn't for the dreams. They were lush, vivid, and followed the stories exactly, apart from their gruesome endings. For weeks afterwards, I woke up shivering, my head full of beautiful faces with ink-black eyes, and the lingering sensation of my limbs severed one by one, while I was still alive. Nope. I replied to Amy's question. Nothing comes to mind. It was the beginning of our friendship. From that day forward, Amy stayed and chatted for a while whenever she dropped off my meals. I wasn't sure what she saw in me, but I was grateful for the company. Maybe, I thought, she just needed somebody outside of her family to talk to. When my mother, Jennifer, was a bookkeeper, she had kept a hot plate and a kettle of tea for visitors. I tried to live up to her tradition, but apart from the occasional friendly delivery driver, I hardly ever had any visitors. Amy's presence made that December a happy and hopeful time for me, or at least as happy and hopeful as any time can be in a place like Weeping Tree Books. Knowing that we would see each other again made my daily grind more bearable. All that daydreaming also distracted me, making me overlook things whose importance I wouldn't understand until it was already too late. The man in the brown jacket returned often, and each visit was longer than the last. After he gave me the slip for a second time, however, I gave up on trying to follow him or discover what he was doing. There was something familiar, too, about the young red-headed guy who had stopped, music, to stare into the display window for a few minutes, but I barely noticed them. I had more bigger things to think about, and the most urgent was how was I going to tell her? It was clear from the way that Amy snuggled close to me while we talked and brushed her fingers against mine that we were becoming more than friends. What would happen if she wanted to go see a movie together or take a walk in the park? If I had told her the truth, she would think that I was insane. If I stalled, she would eventually get tired of waiting and move on. The turning point came on Christmas Eve. Amy had brought over a string of colored lights and asked if she could put them up in the bookshop window to make the place more festive. I agreed, and not wanting to admit that I was unable to walk past the display shelf to help. She was still working when the man in the brown jacket strode out of the door, as businesslike as ever. Suddenly, Amy paused. "What is it?" "I think I know that guy," she muttered. "He's from my PhD program." No, it can't be. Jacob wouldn't be caught dead in a leather jacket. Until that moment, I hadn't realized that Amy had been just as elusive about her time at college as I was about my work at the bookstore. What had she studied? Why had she quit? That night, when she came back with a 3-course meal and a bottle of wine to share in the glow of the festive lights, those questions were the last thing on my mind. Amy wound up spending the night with me. I made up all sorts of excuses to justify why I was allowing her to stay without warning her about the bookstore's dangers, but the simple and selfish truth was that I wanted her more than I cared about the potential consequences. We drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, and woke to the sound of crying outside the door. "What's that noise?" Amy mumbled groggily, and then sat up and felt around for her clothes in the dark. "It sounds like some kid is hurt." Of course. I was used to the nocturnal noises of the bookstore, grumbles, shouts, and distant conversations, the haunting, distant songs of a choir, the rowdy chaos of a party. Sometimes I thought that I recognized the voices, but more often they just sounded like incoherent gibberish. There were metallic groans and reverberating clangs, as though the store itself was music, stretching out after a long day. But this screeching infant was something new. And just like Amy had said, it sounded like an abandoned child. The staff room was pitch dark, and I didn't realize what Amy was doing until I heard her zip up her sweater. "Hey, where are you going?" I whispered. "There's a kid in trouble out there," she grunted. "We've got to do something." I tried to argue that the noise was coming from the apartments up above, and that she couldn't possibly be hearing what she thought she was hearing inside of a closed-down bookstore. But Amy refused to listen. When John was little, I went out to the backyard while I was supposed to be watching him. I'm not even sure why I did it, but when I got back, he had knocked a glass bowl onto the floor and sliced his foot wide open. He was bawling his eyes out just like that. "You can stay if you want, but I'm going." While I fumbled around for more excuses, Amy found the light switch and opened the staff room door. It was around 3 a.m., the blackest hour of the night, and the concrete plaza outside was covered by a fine layer of snow. The crying seemed to be coming from 2 or 3 aisles away, and Amy was already hurrying toward it. A heap of white sheets lay between the shelves. Something wiggled underneath. "Amy, stop!" I hissed, grabbing her wrist. She had dragged me halfway down the aisle toward the pile when the wrongness of the whole thing finally seemed to dawn on her. The bookstore's eerie yellowish lights, the lateness of the hour, the presence of that squirming bundle with no sign of how it had come to be there or why. Whatever was beneath the blanket must have noticed our presence as well. After a few more half-hearted cries, it had stopped whimpering. It was waiting for us to come closer. When no one moved, the bundle of white cloth inched tentatively in our direction. Amy took a nervous step back, and suddenly it was scrambling toward us with a predator's speed, crying out from pain, but from the thrill of the hunt. Amy and I crashed into each other in our mad dash for the staff room door. We closed and barricaded it behind us, but I wasn't sure if it would be enough. I usually survived the nights in Weeping Tree Books by laying low and not drawing attention to myself, not by having some sort of defense system. Something slammed against the door hard enough to rattle it. Amy and I braced it with our backs and felt the second slam reverberate through our bones. I didn't think the hinges could survive a third blow. The bookstore fell silent. Then we heard it, a low moaning cry trying to lure us out once more. After what felt like an eternity, it gave up, or at least seemed to. The only noise was the rumble of the heating system and our own panting, frightened breaths. "What the hell was that?" I told Amy everything. If there was ever a time that she might believe me, it was now. To my surprise, she accepted the whole story at face value. "As some of the stuff you're describing reminds me of the scary stories that my grandmother used to tell. She used to swear that they were true, and she was no fool. Besides," Amy added, "the idea of a bookstore that defies the laws of physics is actually not too far off from what I was studying." Amy explained that Dr. Balash, her thesis mentor, specialized in the study of anomalies in physics, places where gravity seemed to work the wrong way, or that it measured larger on the inside than on the outside. He saw himself as a champion for truth, disproving what he considered to be crackpot conspiracy theories and bad science. I always got the impression that Dr. Balash actually had two lines of research, a public one that he shared with the world, and a private one that was limited to just a few of his preferred students, like Jacob. At the time, I felt awful about not being admitted to his inner circle, but looking back, I'm almost grateful. The more time that passes, the more it feels like a cult. There is no way that Amy and I were getting back to sleep after what we had just experienced, so we talked until we saw daylight through the crack beneath the door. When Amy inched it open, I held the chair at the ready just in case, but there was nothing on the other side apart from an abandoned white sheet and some fresh fingernail-sized scrapes on the door. "If you don't want to come back," I told Amy, "trust me. I understand." "Are you kidding?" Amy shook her head. "This is the most incredible thing that I've ever seen, and it was right across from my parents' restaurant all along." For an awful moment, I feared that the store would trap Amy on her way past the display case, just as it did for me. But then she was out in the snowy plaza waving at me through the cheerful lights that she had hung up in the bookshop window. She headed back toward the restaurant to get to our breakfast, and I put some water in the kettle for our tea. I was about to turn the hot plate on when all hell broke loose. The dusty bell swung wildly as a boot crashed into the front door of Weeping Tree Books. It was the man in the brown leather jacket with a gun pressed against Amy's head. The young red-headed guy followed after him along with a short-haired woman in round spectacles who I'd never seen before. "Jesus, Jacob!" Amy screamed. "What the hell are you doing?" The man called Jacob gestured at me with his pistol. "Do as you're told and nobody gets hurt," he snapped. I lifted my hands. The whole thing felt unreal, like I was playing a part in some old movie. "There isn't much in the till," I informed him. "But you can have it all." The redhead and the woman in the glasses looked at each other and laughed. "Money? You think we're after money?" Jacob jabbed his pistol toward the interior of the bookstore. "There's stuff in there that's worth more than all the silver and gold in the world combined, but you know that already, don't you? I want you to line up 10 feet ahead of me on the blue cable. We're going to take a little stroll. If one of you tries to run, I shoot the other. How's that for a deal?" I followed Jacob's orders, trying to arrange my thoughts. Although our captor made a big show of waving the pistol around, I could tell from the tense and practical way that he held it that he wasn't used to firearms. He was, however, aware of the blue cable that served as a guide through the dark fathoms of the bookstore. I wondered how much more he knew. Before long, the plaza outside the window disappeared from view. Wherever Jacob was taking us, I had a feeling that it would be a while before we got there. How long did his last trip into the bookstore last? 6 hours? Even more? Did Dr. Balash put you up to this? Amy had asked, and Jacob answered right away, forgetting his own orders to keep silent. Balash, he snorted. You've got to be kidding me. He's been hoarding information on places like this for years, and he never once considered how useful it might be. When I think about all the hours that I spent under his thumb calibrating instruments and doing research that would never see the light of day, well, Jacob smirked. Music. All that wasted time did have one benefit. I met you. What are you talking about? Amy demanded. Places like this leave an electromagnetic residue that Dr. Balash's tools are designed to measure. You didn't notice, but when you walked into his office for the first time, all the gauges went off the charts. Otherwise, I never would have been able to convince him to admit you into the program. Jacob laughed at Amy's stunned silence. What? You thought you made it into a top physics program at a top university on merit alone. The only thing Balash and the rest of us wanted from you was this location, and now we've got it. He waved his pistol around, as though trying to reassert his authority. Now keep walking. Although I ventured into the depths of weeping tree books every day, I never quite got used to the experience. Those endless aisles of ugly carpet, those glowing incandescent light bulbs set just far enough apart to create pools of shadow, those shoddy particle board shelves that seemed to move whenever they weren't being watched. And above all, the lingering, inescapable sensation that something was following on the ceiling, around a corner, somewhere just out of sight. Most people couldn't stand it for more than a few minutes, but Jacob and his crew hardly seemed to notice. Music. I wondered whether it was because they had been in places like this before, or if they were just too fixated on finding whatever they were looking for to notice. My legs were beginning to ache by the time that we encountered the red cable at the top of a spiral staircase. Here, Jacob informed the others. His crew stopped, placed their black backpacks on the floor, and paused for a break. Jacob tossed Amy and I a water bottle and some energy bars. You see, I'm not a monster. Not as long as you both cooperate. We ate in silence, and then continued down the stairs. That oppressive, music, feeling of being observed only grew stronger. It was as though we were passing through the entrails of some enormous beast. I knew from experience that the further one wandered from the main floor, the less stable and more dangerous weeping tree books became. But were Jacob and his crew aware of that fact? The way they had taken out flashlights and rope during our break suggested that they were, but I doubted this trio of graduate students fully understood what they were getting themselves into. Still, it raised an uncomfortable question. If Jacob didn't need us to help him navigate the bookstore, then why had he brought us along at all? I lost count of how many floors we passed. Some were lit by cheery lights without a single book in a language that I couldn't identify. Others were all dark wood shelves and dusty tomes, as gloomy and ominous as the inside of an anglerfish's mouth. The steps had changed as well, becoming wide at concrete slabs or narrow wooden slats depending on the level that we were passing. Each time I rounded a corner, I expected some unknowable horror to leap up and drag me into the darkness. But the monster that I was expecting never came. Maybe, I thought, as I listened to Jacob mutter to one of his accomplices, we had brought the monsters in here with us. My one comfort was the presence of the red cable winding its way down the central column of the staircase, like some endless crimson serpent. I took advantage of the distraction to look back at my captors and at Amy. She was drumming her fingers nervously on her jeans. Behind her, Jacob and the redhead were inspecting a small silver device and nodding at one another. The woman with glasses had taken over the gun and aimed it unwaveringly at Amy and I. Unlike Jacob, it was clear from her stance and trigger control that she knew what she was doing. Phones and internet didn't work inside of weeping tree books, but the device in the redhead's palm seemed to simpler than that. Almost like a mercury thermometer for supernatural activity. I realized that it was probably the same device that I had seen him using in the plaza several days earlier. And while I couldn't imagine what it might be pointing to, we seemed to be almost there. Black and white were the only colors on the next floor. The surgically bright fluorescent lights were a far cry from the cozy incandescent bulbs that I was used to, and the polished tile floor gave the place the ambience of a sinister hospital. The shelves were all white metal, and binders lining them were all the same identical shade of black. With my red sweater and khaki pants, music, I felt like an invader as we exited the stairwell. Suddenly, I wanted very badly to hold Amy's hand, or anybody's hand. Music, for that matter. This didn't seem like a place where humans should go. Jacob cleared his throat. I got moving. There was no text on the shelves here, nor any indication of where we should go apart from the redhead's weird device. I kept glancing back at the stairs, hoping that they wouldn't just disappear. The total silence magnified the echo of pages turning up ahead. Jacob nodded to the woman in glasses, who lowered her pistol slightly as we crossed into the next aisle. The man in the center turned around like he had been expecting us. His striped pants, a suspenders, and white-collared shirt had probably been stylish about 100 years ago, but now they were in tatters. He wore his wide-brimmed hat pulled low, hiding his face from view, but something about his mustache and sideburns seemed too familiar. "Arthur Lane Mackle?" Jacob inquired. The man smiled, revealing hideously receded purplish-black gums. The name triggered something in my memory. That ever-tightening aisle, the corpses, the locket. L.M. Arthur Lane Mackle. I was looking at the last living member of that butchered family, although I wasn't sure living was the right word. His skin was pale as death, and the stuff flowing through the veins underneath looked more like ink than blood. "I brought what you asked for," announced Jacob. "Good lad," Arthur cackled. "Here," he rasped, pulling one of the black binders free and ripping out a page. "This one might interest you. On the fabrication of plagues, written by a 16th-century warlock. Very rare, very effective, and very valuable to the people up there, I'm sure." The paper that he handed to Jacob seemed to be a map of sorts, a guide from this room to a specific shelf in the bookstore. I noticed something else as well. The bumps on the spine of the binder and along the shelves weren't any accident. They were Braille. "I understand why you wanted us to bring you the girl," Jacob commented as he pocketed the paper. "It must be awfully lonely down here. But what about him?" Arthur chuckled. "Would you believe that I actually volunteered to be the bookkeeper? I was 26 and the Great War was on, and we couldn't risk the enemy gaining access to the anomalous places like this one. I thought that I had the stomach for it. I even moved my family in here with me. I thought that one little bookstore couldn't possibly be worse than the battlefields that I had seen in France. But I was wrong." Arthur circled around me. Something about this place brought my memories to life. The foes that I had killed, the friends I had lost. I could see them, smell them, hear their screams, because in a way I had brought them in here with me too. And as you all know, there was no escape. Day after day, year after year, it was that sort of torture that drives a man to consider insane possibilities and do awful things, even to the people that he loves. I offered up my wife and child to any power in this accursed place that could free me from my role as a bookkeeper. And you know what? Something answered. Its promise was a trap. I should have known better than to imagine that I would ever be allowed to leave. Instead of the bookkeeper, it transformed me into the codex. I know the location of every volume in Weeping Tree books, and yet I cannot read a single one. Arthur removed his hat, revealing a pair of black pits where his eyes had once been. "I'm sure you've got quite a lovely set of peepers yourself, lad. You two, hold them. I don't want us struggling to damage those lovely green eyes." Jacob and the redhead moved to grip my arms, and then everything seemed to happen at once. Amy grabbed a binder, chucked it at the girl in glasses, and bolted. The girl in glasses fired, music, her pistol. Her shot went wide and hit the thing that had once been Arthur Lane Mackle in the gut. A viscous black liquid, like ink, oozed from his wound onto the tile. But the codex barely seemed to notice. He was focused on me and acquiring the pair of eyes that he had been promised. Before the girl in glasses could reestablish her aim, I dashed in the opposite direction from Amy. It would be harder to catch both of us, I figured, and eventually I could circle back around, provided, of course, that I didn't get lost or caught. The codex might not have been able to see, but my running footsteps were enough for him to pinpoint my location. He, Jacob, and the girl in glasses were hot on my heels. Only the redhead appeared to have gone after Amy. Another shot rang out, punching a hole in a binder just beside my left leg. I'd gotten lucky 2 times, but I doubted that there would be a third. I was raising my arms to surrender when a shriek made me spin around. The codex had snapped the neck of the girl with glasses, and now it was turning on Jacob, pinning him to the shelves with one hand and reaching toward his face with the other. I looked away in time to avoid witnessing what he did, but I couldn't blot out the fleshy sound of an eyeball being plucked from its socket, and then another. The codex had no intention of helping me or Jacob, I realized. All it wanted was its sight restored and a fellow prisoner with whom to pass the time. The terrible knowledge that he had promised to Dr. Balash's students had never been anything more than a distraction. Behind me, the codex was laughing, a dry, rasping sound that couldn't entirely drown out Jacob's agonized groans. "The colors! They're so beautiful. I ran through the endless aisles shouting Amy's name. The only response was the echoing footsteps of the codex, approaching faster and faster behind me. I swerved left and right, hoping to lose him, but it was hopeless. This labyrinth was his domain, and I could no longer even guess in which direction the stairs might lie. A hand shot out from the next aisle. Amy pushed me up against the shelves and pressed a finger to my lips. Even faster footfalls were approaching from our left. "You little," the redhead roared. "Get back here!" He charged right past us and then stopped dead. He had come face to face with the codex. There were sounds of a scuffle of fists and boots connecting with flesh. It ended with a strangled cry. Amy was already pulling me in the opposite direction. "I found something," she whispered. "Come on." Another right, another left, and then I saw it. A torn-off yellow cable dangling from a shaft in the wall. I thought back to Anna, the bookkeeper who had first placed the cables in her final torn-out journal entry. She had been following the yellow cable to the exit. She had been following it to the codex, hoping that even as a captive of the bookstore himself, he might know a way out. It was possible that I really hadn't imagined the sensation of something breathing at the other end of the narrow tunnel during my own escape attempt. He might have been there all along, waiting eagerly for another chance to steal a pair of eyes. "I know where this leads," I told Amy, "but I should probably go first just in case." We took one last look around the black and white maze of Weeping Tree Books' record room. The quiet was unsettling. Where had the codex gone? Was he still busy with what was left of Jacob and his crew? I heaved myself up the cable and into the claustrophobic space, which was about as wide around as an air duct. Dragging myself forward into the dark with a single arm outstretched, I felt like a foolhardy caver. What would I do if I got stuck, or if the space closed in around me? I bent around a spine-cracking corner and finally saw light at the end of the tunnel. I recognized the room ahead, and those 3 innocent victims as freshly dead as if Arthur McCallan killed them only a few minutes before. As I scrambled free of the narrow space, I could hear Amy still struggling in the tunnel behind me. I warned her not to look too closely at the room that she was about to see. She had just rounded the hairpin turn when her eyes widened. Without warning, she slipped backward. "He's got me," Amy yelped. I grabbed her arms and pulled. Amy screamed, caught in a painful tug-of-war, one that I knew I would lose. I could feel the muscles in my legs starting to give out. The codex had more hateful strength in a single hand than I had in my whole body. And then, with a snap and a grunt, Amy slipped free and came crashing out onto my chest. I almost didn't want to inspect the damage. What if her foot had been torn off, or worse? A bruising, bloodied handprint covered Amy's bare ankle. But the only thing missing was her sock and sneaker. The codex didn't come crawling out of that awful tunnel after us, probably because he was a prisoner of the records room, just as I was a prisoner of the rest of the store. A fact which made me realize exactly how much Arthur McCallan's bitter sacrifice had cost him. Rather than being trapped for one lifespan in the bizarre bookstore, he was trapped for eternity in a single room. A room that, up until now, he had been unable to even see. "Are you all right?" I asked Amy. "No, but I'll live." Amy limped to a standing position and draped her arm around my shoulders. Side by side, we limped back to the front desk of Weeping Tree Books.